everybody. Welcome to the Leader to Leader podcast, the show where we dive into strategies, stories, best practices, and breakthrough moments that shape world-class leadership in today's fast-moving business climate. I'm your host, Tom Athenour. Today, we're going to be pulling back the curtain on one of the most dramatic business transformations in the property restoration industry. My guest is Tony Garver, Chief Administration Officer at First Onsite, a billion-dollar commercial and residential disaster recovery company. Over the last decade, Tony has helped propel this company from a small niche player to an industry giant with 3,000 employees and high nine-figure revenues. How did they do it? By acquiring 25 companies in just 2.5 years and making it work. That kind of explosive growth doesn't happen without bold leadership, a sharp strategy, and the ability to unite and align people and cultures. In this episode, Tony and I will dig into the leadership practices that fuel successful mergers and acquisitions, how to align leadership teams, embrace different cultures, lead with curiosity, trust, and clarity when everything is moving so quickly. So if you've ever led through an acquisition or even just a big shift in your organization, you'll get a ton of good practical insights from Tony. Let's get into it. Tony, welcome to the L2O podcast show. Great to have you.
Well, Tom, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
You bet. You know, I've been looking forward to this conversation because a lot of our clients have embraced an M&A strategic growth objectives and have done a lot of that activity. And some of it has been successful, but a lot of it has not been as successful as originally planned. And so I've been looking forward to this conversation because you've done a lot of M&A activity as part of First Onsite. And so today we're going to be talking about what you've learned along the way and what might you impart to our listeners that would help them bring more strategic and thoughtful approaches to this whole activity within organizational life. And so that's what we're going to be talking about. But before we jump into that, Tony, talk a little bit about First Onsite. Give it a little bit of context for our discussion.
Yeah, great. It's a fascinating topic and one that I'm super interested in and have lived the good, the bad, and the ugly of for the past 5 or 6 years as it relates to M&A and acquisitions. And First Onsite really started as a company called Interstate Restoration back in 1997. And the idea was a little bit different than traditional restoration companies in that the founder was very focused on end users versus insurance companies. And typically restoration work comes from insurance companies, but there's a path through end users. And so Stacy grew the company for many, many years. I joined well after the founding in 2015. And we were just at the place in 2015 of really committing to acquisition as a growth strategy. And so in 2016, we acquired a company in Canada, very large company. It doubled the size from a FTE perspective. And then over the next 3 years, we acquired somewhere around 25 or 26 different companies. And we did this with the help of a great consulting firm and a lot of trial and error. So we didn't get it perfect. We did well and we stumbled. And so I have lots of fun stories to tell you about as it relates to the growth strategy that we embraced.
So 25 acquisitions in a 2.5, 3-year time frame.
Yeah.
Was the original strategy very focused on growth, new markets, new innovation, technology? What drove that objective of getting in that level of M&A activity?
Yeah, it's a great question. So Interstate was designed without a branch network. And so we operated generally with what you might envision as being kind of quick hit teams that were remote that could jump on a plane and fly somewhere and address a situation. We knew that at the time, our goal was to get to $1 billion in revenue, and we were somewhere well south of $500 million. And we knew we had to have a strong branch network, one, to compete with other large restoration companies, and two, to service our customers the right way. And so it became kind of maybe a three-pronged approach. One, we wanted to find some areas of differentiation through acquisition. Healthcare as example, something the Interstate did but wasn't necessarily great at. We wanted to find someone who was great at healthcare, and so we looked at business segments as one means. Filling white
And
space.
so
Oh,
when you
go ahead.
talk about restoration within healthcare, you're talking about major disasters within hospitals or healthcare
Yeah,
systems, and then you
yeah,
come in and you parachute in
yeah.
and bring it back, right?
Yeah, and Tom, yeah, on the scale of damage, it can be anywhere from an overflowing toilet adjacent to an operating room, which would carry with it some real challenges about getting it cleaned. Obviously,
Yes,
there's a different standard in a hospital, all the way through a roof coming off during a hurricane. We've seen everything across that spectrum, and so the response sometimes can be one or two people. Sometimes it has to be a whole team of people, depending on what the situation is.
okay, cool. So healthcare was one
Yep.
vertical or an industry or a
Yep.
market that you wanted to expand into that you weren't currently in with your current branch system
Yeah, we
with
we weren't
Interstate.
deep into the market. We
Okay,
wanted,
okay,
again, we wanted to have, we still do. We want to have areas that we differentiate from our competitors a little bit with, and so we poured
sure.
some resources into that.
Okay, good. And so that was expanding new markets. Was there
Yep.
any was and then obviously trying to get up to that 1 billion is what I heard. That was your target from a growth, a revenue perspective.
Correct.
And so that was part of it. What else was there anything else that you were trying to sort of acquire that was part of the overall strategy?
Yeah, one of the things that we wanted to do is have operations in what we call the pro sports cities. And so because we bought a company in Canada, we used to call it the NFL cities, but the NFL doesn't exist in Canada. And so we pulled it back to the pro sports cities. And these are major metropolitan areas that have large areas of population, large square footage of commercial properties, large residential areas. And so where we didn't have a presence, we focused a little bit on those white spaces, if you will.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Awesome.
Yeah.
Good.
And I think those two are the primary drivers. And then there's always, with our company, there's always an eye on great leadership talent. So if for instance, you decided, um, you met someone and gained a lot of respect for the business they were running, and they were in kind of a uh, maybe a city that isn't a pro sports city. Let's pick on maybe Birmingham, Alabama, for example.
Okay.
But you met someone who really was running a great business, and they really demonstrated some solid leadership, something that could scale into a larger organization, hopefully. That would be a third group that we would look for, and you found those. They sometimes they would raise their hand to you, and sometimes you would just find them kind of through the matrix, if you will, of doing your day in and day out M&A work.
Yeah. Yeah. So you had this very aggressive acquisition strategy, and you were talking about how you doubled employees. You were looking at revenue,
Yeah,
huge increases in revenue, to the point where now you're a billion-dollar plus company with over 3,000 employees, right? Pretty
yeah,
much North America. Is that where you're located?
yeah. That's exactly right, Tom. You nailed all of those for sure. Roughly split from a head count, half in Canada, half in the U.S. We service Mexico and the Caribbean. We've done some overseas work, but we're very focused on North America right now.
Okay. All right. So let's talk a little bit about what some of those successes have been and what some of the learnings have been when things did not go as well as you'd originally planned. So walk us through that because you guys have, my sense is you've gotten it down. In fact, if you look at some of the data, those that acquire more frequently, those organizations that acquire more frequently, they actually have a better success rate than those that are infrequent
Mm,
acquirers, if you think
yeah,
about it that way. And so
yeah,
you've had a lot of reps, a lot of
yeah,
practice in this
yeah.
area. So talk about if I were a company, head of a company or on a senior team contemplating an acquisition or trying to bring one in, what are some things that would be most helpful? What really has to be um, on our radar screen? What do we need to
Yeah.
be most critically focused in on?
Yeah, I think the number one thing for us is actually leadership, what that senior leadership team looks like, and do they have the skill set, um, one, to join what would be a larger company. In every instance, we bought a company that was significantly smaller from a revenue standpoint than we were at the time. And with that comes complexity, right? And so uh, can those leaders grow into what typically is going to be a more senior role? We tend to, well, we tended to, and still do, give those newly acquired leaders um, a lot of runway to do what they do. And this comes from our CEO's philosophy around, kind of maintaining the entrepreneurial spirit in the acquisition. It's very tricky, because what you bump up against is priorities, agendas. At the end of the day, and I'll say this a lot during our conversation, Tom, it's about the people. And the best strategy in the world, if you don't have the people kind of rowing in the right direction or the same direction, you're just not going to be effective. And we've experienced both things. We've experienced absolute adoption, day one, take my old jersey off, put my new jersey on, and I'm 100% first onsite. We've experienced the middle of the road there, where I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure what I'm supposed to be doing, and we've experienced complete. Nope, I'm not doing that. We're not gonna make that change. We're not gonna, as an example, we're not gonna come onto the broader payroll system. Really? Okay, well, let's talk about that, right? And so you you very early, before we got to 10 acquisitions, we experienced kind of all of those things. And I think it was a gift, Tom, because it forced us to modify our playbook to account for the variations, because we went into these acquisitions and still do to this day with a very not necessarily a hands-off approach, but a light glove approach. Again, we don't want to ruin the. We don't. What does Jeff say? Don't mess up the special sauce,
Right.
right? And so
Right.
we kind of lean in, not hard. And with that comes some wonderful things around creativity and the entrepreneurial spirit and growing a business in a region or a branch, a city. And with it comes some complications, maybe on the back end of the business around compliance or HR or IT, these types of things. And trying to balance those two things becomes
Yeah.
what, from our experience and my experience, is what the job is when it gets into the M&A and the integration part of it.
Did you find when you said that you had to adjust your playbook or whatever the term that you used, or your formula,
Mhm.
was it more around having not more non-negotiables, meaning we, as part of this deal, we have to integrate systems, we
Yeah.
have to look at HR compliance, we have to look at some of these non-negotiables that we have to have integrated into First Onsite. Is that what I'm hearing? And then there are some things that we want to still keep intact
Yeah.
that are really serving.
Yeah, you're hearing it the right way, Tom, and there are some non-negotiables. What is interesting is there may, for us, sometimes there was a non-negotiable, but the time frame for adoption was allowed to expand. So with a couple of our acquisitions, we didn't convert their name initially. They were strong in a region where we didn't exist. We didn't want to alienate their customer base by switching their name. And in some places, New Orleans is a great example. There's a lot of pride culturally in New Orleans around being from New Orleans. And so having a business that is part of the fabric of the culture of New Orleans was important. And so in a situation like that, we would extend the conversion so that we had time to talk to each customer about what we were doing and what was coming. And so where we were practicing change management on the team we just acquired, we were also practicing a little bit on our customer and to bring them along, and applied some of the same thinking and some of the same tools like feedback channels at the customer.
Yeah. So I'm interested in that. I get the kind of having the flavor for certain regions and markets, kind of that brand presence within those areas. I get that. And I'm kind of like when you're trying to integrate the people side of it, the
Yep,
leadership side. I want to unpack that and double click it a little bit more.
sure.
Was that more challenging than you originally thought it would be to integrate that leadership? Was there resistance? Was there hesitation, skepticism? I mean, what were some of the challenges you faced
All of
with
those
that
things.
integration?
Yeah,
Okay.
Tom, all of those things you've kind of nailed it. There's a couple things that stand out to me in my experience, and again, I'll caveat all this saying this is Tony's experience. It probably isn't representative of the world. I'm sure others have experienced things similarly. And um, there's, when you acquire a company and you treat it the way we do, which is to kind of hold on to that entrepreneurial spirit, you empower those leaders to do what they've always done. And with that, there's always a sense of, well, I'm really successful. I've sold my company, so I've kind of got something figured out here. And then you kind of smash that up against the realities of being a much larger organization. And there's a gap, and you know that gap sometimes can be very wide, and sometimes recognition of that gap isn't doesn't come easily to those newly acquired leaders. And so
Meaning
you
they don't agree on the gap.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm tap
Yeah.
dancing
You'll
around
get
that a
that
little
signal.
bit, Tom, but they don't agree with
Yeah.
the direction, and
Yeah.
or they want control. And one of the things that we bump into with some frequency is acquired leaders believing they should have a higher level of control and decision making across the broader enterprise. And
Mm.
it takes some time to get them used to. They've got to orientate to their new situation, their new surroundings. And many times they hit the ground kind of running. We're going to make changes. We're going to do this right away. And and a lot of times it's, hey, we'll get to that, but let's slow down and absorb a little bit and understand um, the playing field we're on. Let's understand what people are doing who weren't in your acquired company, but they're still at this company. They may have a job and they may be addressing this. You're new here. You may not have awareness, right? So a little bit of a lot of what we coached was showing up curious for those new leaders as we tried to bring them in. Look, you're going to see things that you think are broken, maybe, but there's going to be a rationale or a reason why it works a certain way. So be curious about that, as opposed to where we've had leaders do this, show up and demand. We can't do it that way. We're not going to do it that way, and that can create some real conflict within the existing teams, and it can create some animosity at the newly acquired organization. So sometimes it can become us versus them,
Oh yeah.
which is where we
Definitely.
don't want to get to, right? So much of what
Yeah.
we did from a tools perspective, and I'll talk about this, is build feedback channels that are almost real time. So you start to learn about rumblings very early in the process.
Okay. Awesome. So it's really is it fair to say that you came in a little bit more heavy-handed, and then you realized that it was more important to engage and bring them on board, which kind of lightened it a little bit. Am I understanding that correctly? That you
Yeah,
really want, and then really trying to change that mindset that around the curiosity and what could be, as opposed to trying to protect or almost like a reactive defensiveness that you were trying to
yeah,
mitigate. Is that kind of
yeah. I think you're kind of seeing it the right way, Tom. I think it's always challenging when you've got an existing organization that is successful and you start acquiring companies. There are elements of that existing entity that kind of run with bright lines around what they do. And I'll pick on HR. HR reports up
okay?
through me. HR is to some degree, a pretty heavy compliance department. They're, EEOC and FMLA, and there's a lot of stuff you have to kind of do. And there's not fuzzy areas on the edges of it. You got to kind of you have to do these things. Um, Sometimes those team members, the leaders who are involved in the integration, maybe representing HR, representing IT, would be very kind of direct and bright line, and this is the way you have to do it, to the newly acquired organization. And that many times resulted in kind of a reaction. And so we experienced that initially a couple different ways. It's actually how I got into, I got asked to come in and build out the integration management office. After our first couple of acquisitions, really, we had a lot of conflict. And so I got involved and didn't have any of the answers on how to solve for this, but I started to look at the people and started to think more about, if I'm a newly acquired leader who is very successful and, got a big check and maybe got generational wealth from an acquisition or something like that, how am I thinking about this? And then if I'm an HR administrator trying to manage and do some integration with them, how am I thinking about this? And somewhere in the middle is where you maybe aren't going to make everyone happy, but you've got to try and find the middle. And to do that, you have to listen to both sides and solve a problem. And many times that's how we did this. It was very problem based. And as we encountered an issue, signage, let's say, well, I don't want the sign to say this, I want it to say this. Well, our broader organization does it this way. This is the way we go to market. Yeah, but that doesn't work for me. Well, you have to make a decision there. Do you allow this variance or do you not allow this variance? And you have to talk about it. Now you do that once or twice. The third and fourth time, you've kind of been through that. It's much easier. You know it's coming, right? We didn't hire, and maybe it would have been a good thing to do. We didn't hire seasoned M&A integration experts to come in. We got some outside consulting help, but we, as a
Yeah.
group, were not experienced at all at mass acquisition. And so a lot of this, like I alluded to earlier in the conversation, was fall off the bike, get back on it, keep pedaling and learn so you don't fall off again. And we very rapidly, because of the rate of acquisition, worked through those things, which again, refined that playbook. The playbook was very much a living document that was refined after every deal, sometimes mid deal, to help us avoid the friction of integration as much as
Yeah.
possible. Not perfect, but
Yeah. So what I'm hearing here is a bit of this. You use the word balance multiple times, meaning if you're coming in from a curiosity, but you're really listening to both sides and trying to find the integration of oftentimes two seemingly opposite positions
yeah,
on what needs to be taken place to try to find the best common between that you all can live with as the acquiring organization and that they can live with because you want to keep that level of engagement. That took a lot of time is my guess.
yep.
It's easier to just to mandate, but you run the risk of disengagement, which is it true that that's where a lot of sort of the challenges around culture and all those integration and even systems and ops, is that where that tends to show up?
Yeah, it kind of shows up everywhere that you have to hard connect to each other,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So if you're going to
Yeah.
couple the rail cars in the yard, you got to get that connection locked in. But if you're constantly doing that, you're not locked in. You got to lock in, right? And so almost across every functional area, legal, risk, safety, HRIT, name the back end departments, if you will, the supporting departments, the administrative departments. There are points of friction and there are points of compromise. And so a big part of it was having the right leadership at the senior level at First Onsite, who was, and a great leader in our CEO, coaching us around, let's be flexible, let's accommodate, let's welcome them in, and let's adapt where we can so we don't do any damage and we get out of it what we bought, which is, M&A is about buying future revenue in Tony's opinion, right? It's
Yeah.
not day one that you get it, it's day five or year five or year 10 that it starts to pay the dividends sometimes. And you can't break it in the first few weeks. You gotta kind of sort through it. Versus, some of our competitors are much more deliberate that they buy and they change the company colors the next day. They take the leadership and they assign them to very specific roles, and that's your role. And that's a viable strategy. A lot of companies, day one, rip the Band-Aid, and this is what you are. We just tend to be a little bit more nuanced about that and a little bit more flexible with the acquisitions. And the good side of it, Tom, was as we were going through this very heavy period of acquisition, the industry was besieged by private equity doing the same thing. And our reputation on the street came back to us through investment bankers about what a great experience it was from the integration perspective. And that actually became a benefit when we would look at new prospects. They had heard that. They were very curious, and some chose us because of that. So you get these, you can't, I think it's really difficult to create a KPI out of that. It's a sense. It's a, well, I I feel safer with these guys. I've heard good things with these guys. And so maybe that's the right place for me to go. Right. And
Yeah.
that's hard to put on a balance sheet or a P&L, right? That's a culture thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really tricky, but we got good at that piece.
And then built a recognition and a brand
Yeah.
essence, if you will, around bringing that to
Yeah.
the acquisitions when you were engaged in those. That's
Yeah.
fascinating. If you were trying to sort of capsulate maybe the biggest failures and then ultimately learnings. Hopefully you failed fast and
Yeah.
learned from it and moved
Yeah. Yeah.
on.
Yeah.
I suspect that you did.
Yeah.
What were some of those things that surprised you that looking back on it, you've really worked through them and you've worked them out and changed the playbook on this thing?
Yeah. Never underestimate, um, never underestimate the team that is being acquired, and never overestimate the team that's being acquired. And we've made mistakes in both directions, right? We assumed we acquired a company with great leaders, and it turns out that a year in, you're like, oh, this didn't work, right? Sometimes we acquire them and you get really pleasantly surprised about the skill set, many times embedded down in the acquired organization. People, the clouds kind of part, roles change, and stars rise. And those are two, kind of a positive and a negative one that I think requires the patience and curiosity, but you don't, I didn't expect that. I wasn't sure what to expect, Tom, I'll be honest. Those are two big learnings for me. Be patient through the process, be deliberate, make sure you have expectations really clearly laid out. And we made mistakes around that. Sometimes we would assume they knew what we knew, and they didn't,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so you have to, again, it's why we poured so much energy and so many resources into the integration management office for a long period of time. We had to have people that would approach it that way. Very curiously, why would they be reacting this way? Okay, clearly they're upset, or clearly they're thrilled. Let's talk about that. Now let's
So
learn
is
from it.
Yeah, really exploring and trying to understand that. We talk about empathy as being one of those leadership EI skill sets,
Hmm.
capabilities. This is a clear application of that, of where
Yeah,
you're trying to understand where they're coming from as a way to bring them in and
yeah,
kind of hear from their perspective, and then trying to, rather than creating that defensiveness right from the very start,
right,
which is not, and it's not going to work.
right.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah,
we ran that curve. Early on, we had some real pushback from some of the acquired companies, and even at the end, we've had some challenges after all those acquisitions and all the experience. Sometimes things just turn weird on you. Sometimes financial results, um, in our industry, that it tends to be a long sales cycle on a good customer, longer than most businesses. You can't really predict a fire in a building, not legally anyway, right? I mean, so when does work come? And many times you have a bumpiness, a lumpiness to our industry where a couple years will be very high revenue, very high EBITDA, and then you'll flatten out a little bit. The industry will flatten out, and insurance markets kind of demonstrate this when you see a hard market or a soft market in the insurance world. That's really market pricing on what a policy costs, and that's demonstrative many times of the economic climate, the number of hurricanes that hit in a year, natural disasters, those things. And you can't predict most of that stuff. And so sometimes you buy and you think you bought this great company that produces huge revenue, and then they flatten out a little bit, and then leadership gets weird, pressure starts to mount, and then behaviors change there also. And that's a dynamic
Yeah.
outside of the acquisition. That's just a normal market dynamic occurring. But
Yeah.
you have to have awareness and be able to address that also.
Yeah. So this is really fascinating. So looking at the leadership capabilities of the acquiring management team, or the management team of leadership team of the company you're acquiring, and then really not holding sort of your assessment, maybe informal, as opposed to making some preconceived notions,
Yeah.
either from an over capabilities or under capabilities, leaning into it and allowing it to sort of unfold given the sort of what you're trying to create. Is that
Yeah.
what I'm hearing? And
Yeah.
that
That,
takes a lot of work.
that, that's spot on. And you, the balance of patience and go. I want to be
Yeah.
patient, but I want to
Yeah.
go.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's quick taps of both the brake and the accelerator,
Yes.
and you got to pick your spots. And to do that, I think, Tom, you've got to have some experience, and you've got to have some trust. And again, also I keep saying it, it's people. So if you acquire a company, there's pretty much a 100% chance you're not going to have a lot of trust day one. Now you may at the senior level, people that were in the deal, but when you get into the rank and file, you get into the staff. There are many day ones that I went to where people just looked at you sideways, like, what in the heck just happened? I've been part of this 50-person company for 10 years, and what do you mean you just sold it? And it's this is different than Cisco buying an Oracle. It totally
Yes.
different. This
Right.
is this is
Right.
many of these businesses were lifestyle businesses. They were small, they were family run. We took care of our team. We had complete control of the P&L, could do whatever we wanted. And now
Yeah.
there's some restrictions that have come in place. And managing through that day one through day 90 through day 100 is a real challenge sometimes.
So let's talk a little bit about getting the organization on board. We've talked
Mhm.
about the leadership team, and
Yep.
you were talking about sort of as it cascades down the organization. What were some practices or things that you put in place to bring them on board? You talked about feedback loops.
Hmm.
And what else? And I want to kind of go a little bit more on the feedback loops of
Yep.
actually how they were structured, be
Yeah.
kind of specific around that.
Yep.
But was there also something around really sending a message, a consistent message that needed to be cascaded down throughout, that played out to be most effective in getting people on board?
Yeah. Let me start the back half of that, and I'll circle back to
Okay.
feedback loops because they're connected. When I say this, you'll start to understand it. You know, corporate communications are incredibly tricky, incredibly challenging, right? When you start to try and communicate across 3,000 employees, I mean, it's the world's worst telephone game. And many times, um, leadership who you would think would feel compelled to communicate something important to the company just doesn't do it. And so there's a sometimes a lack of understanding, lack of information at kind of mid levels of organizations. That's obvious. Like we've all experienced that, right? Well, in M&A, when you buy a company, that exists, and where you might think the newly acquired leaders have communicated thoroughly or in the right way, we were very deliberate about giving talking points, FAQs, supporting those leaders in their messaging efforts. Many times we wrote the messages for them to help them. Um, Sometimes it just doesn't get heard. Sometimes, I think the old cliche is you got to tell them 10 times before they hear it. We
Yeah.
kind of,
Yeah.
as leaders, we're busy. We stop at 2 and we think, well, they've got to have it by now. So we were experiencing that, and that's really what brought in kind of the expansion of feedback loops. So we created feedback loops that were to just a general question mailbox within our IT department. You got a question about the acquisition, you can use this. We would do weekly check-ins with senior leadership. We would do weekly check-ins with mid-level leadership, kind of on a one-on-one basis. So it was almost where maybe you have a mid-level manager within an acquisition that you happen to know you met on day one. I would go to all the day ones. I would go back 2 weeks later, and I would be very present in the process. You could see, and folks would tackle you as you come through the front door. I've got an issue. Can we talk? It's absolutely what you wanted, right? Because they felt comfortable enough with you to say, can you help me? And then you go in a room and you learn that, something crazy was happening, like they weren't being paid their car allowance, or the car allowance was being handled as an expense item and they were being sent a tax bill, like some crazy thing. You're like, what makes sense for a small entrepreneur to do this, but we can't as a large company. And so you had the personal interaction of leaders of the acquiring company being involved. And then we did that with our departments. So HR would have a dedicated person for that acquisition. IT would. And they were encouraged to pull feedback about the broad operations of the business. If you hear something, say something, report it back and let us address it. So through email, kind of the mailbox that we had, through the weekly meetings and the integration meetings as we're trying to turn on ADP, let's say, you're hearing things. And then by being present, which, for me is the secret sauce of small company acquisition, you have to go be present. You have to stand in their building, show up with a box of donuts, as silly as it sounds, and be social. And I was constantly amazed at what I would learn in a 3-day trip to we bought a company up in in northern New Jersey. And I would go and spend 3 days there. And 2 of those days I was in conference rooms with employees who just were like, how does this work? Can you explain this to me? And it's not because I don't think they were there because their leaders weren't giving them the information. I think they had been messaged to properly. They just didn't feel safe. They didn't feel secure. This, again, back to the Maslow. Do I feel safe? The answer is no. I can't move up. I'm stuck. So let's unstuck them, as I would say. Let's go spend some time with them. And then you would find system issues. You would find system integration issues. You would learn that they didn't know anything about, for us, duct cleaning, or that we even sold duct cleaning. And they had a customer who was looking for it, right? And so those are the things that by being present, you would start to learn. And then you could start to, over time, you start to address those things on day one, so they're not a problem on day 30. And a new set of issues came up. And by the time we got to 18, 19, and 20 of acquisitions, again, they're kind of similar companies, similar size. I used to be able to predict the 10 questions I would hear on a day one town hall. It was about my benefits, it was about my pay, it was about that's what the rank and file was interested in. But you could kind of figure the game out a little bit.
So in looking sort of surveying all of those acquisitions, and I want to sort of go back to this culture, and it sounds like, you weren't trying to replace cultures or reshape them. You still wanted that culture to exist with some influence from First Onsite. So I get that part of it. And then oftentimes leaders will focus on where are we going, the strategies, kind of what's our North Star, what are we trying to accomplish here, whether revenue growth, new markets, and how they communicate to the organization, right? You can do now PowerPoints and AI and they look beautiful and all of that's great.
Yeah.
What I'm hearing from you is that was important, but the one-on-ones or the conference room and being present and the donuts and all that stuff that you all did probably had more impact on engaging hearts and souls and minds to get them on board than the front end blast.
Yeah.
Am I hearing that right?
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. Multiple times, through the 2 years, I would have newly acquired leaders or team members call and say, when are you coming back to Pensacola? Well, I didn't have anything planned till maybe next year. You, what's going on? Well, we're curious. Well, I'll come down next week. And you fly in and you grab the senior leadership team or members of the team, take them to dinner. And again, you're building a relationship. And I think many times, Tom, that relationship building gets lost in the pursuit of Tony's opinion, financial matters. We got to get the P&L right,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah,
Right.
we can get the P&L right for a period of time until the people are so disengaged that the P&L starts to suffer. And so my focus was always on a keen ear to what was happening and compassion and empathy for this enormous shift that these people on both sides, the acquiring company and the acquired company, go through. It's very emotional and raw. Your job is a huge part of your life. Theoretically, we spend 40 hours a week, a third of our lives in our work, and a third of it sleeping. And so, yeah, I think it's very real and very human. And yes, the scorecards are the P&L and the balance sheet and some KPI metrics that around performance. But the way we did it and the way that I think we were successful is really not losing sight of the people. And the number one thing I would say is don't lose track of the people. Get the people right. A million people out there who are smarter than I am will say this. Get the people right. The business will be fine.
Yeah. Right.
That's been our
Right.
experience where we've
Right.
been most successful in acquisitions. We have team members that joined that they got sucked into the story. They got sucked into the opportunity. And almost in every situation, we had people get new opportunities they would have never gotten had they stayed this smaller company. And I find those to be the indicators of success. When you see someone come out of the mid-level of an acquired 40-person company and they end up kind of a senior director over a region, that's a huge win. That's that leadership gold we were trying to find, in addition to the great business that we bought.
Yeah. Yeah, most definitely. One of the things that you mentioned, I don't want it to go unnoticed here, was that one of the things that you underestimated was taking care of the corporate people too.
Yeah,
There's all this focus on the acquisition,
yeah.
and talk a little bit about that. That was something that you missed initially, and it had some impact.
It's it's one of those it's one of those things that probably for the rest of my working career, no question, the rest of my life, I'm not going to lose. Is there are two sides to an acquisition, and many times, and even the consulting team that we had didn't miss it, but didn't pay attention to it. We didn't pay attention to the acquiring team and what they were going through. Where we had um, salespeople that were part of our organization, First Onsite, many times there was friction with the acquired salespeople over accounts. I have this account. Well, we've had this account also. Yeah, but this is my account. Like that happened with every deal.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and understanding how you navigate that, figuring out how to navigate that was very, very tricky. And many times what we would call the legacy interstate group um, felt slighted and didn't like the strategy. And
sure, yeah,
so that becomes very challenging because if you've got a little revolt, a strong word, but if you have some resistance, better word, at legacy interstate, you're right on the edge of disengagement. And at some point you start to see indifference toward the needs of a newly acquired, basically adolescent company coming into the fold, and some damage can get done if you're not paying attention.
totally
And we
see that.
experienced some of that.
Yeah,
There
yeah,
can be that, and many times that company you acquired used to compete openly against you, and things were said to common customers that weren't always flattering. And then on integration day, the two salespeople meet. Well, that's always an interesting one. You didn't like each other yesterday, and today you're on the same team. That's that's hard to manage.
Yes, completely so. I understand that. Yeah, I think, because as you were just talking about what it was like for the legacy people in the
Mhm.
organization, the acquiring companies team, of really looking at that because they're having to change things as well. I mean, there's some giving up certain things, and things are different and
Yeah,
change and challenging the status quo or the way the system as it's operated previously. You've got a lot of things going on there. That's fascinating because when you were talking about that in our prep, I found that to be fascinating to not
yeah,
lose sight of investing in our current team and our current people.
yeah. There's a terrible phrase that gets said um, many times. I've heard it said in our company. They took the check, we bought them, and that's 100% right. It's 100% right. But the whole organization that was acquired didn't benefit from that process initially. Now, some through time and proving out skill get growth opportunities and they get more opportunity in general because they're part of a larger national organization. But if you think that way about and I won't lie, I'm not immune to that myself. It's like, oh, are you kidding me? This is the ask, and good Lord, dude, you just got a huge check, like, and you're whining about this. That you have to get into a place, and I needed a lot of help around this initially, and had some great coaching around it. You have to get into the place to look past that and kind of scrape the surface and understand why do I feel that way, and why are they after this what seems to me kind of unimportant thing, right? There's a reason, and it's usually a good reason. But again, it goes back to that curiosity thing. We overwhelmingly, many of the initial calls we took, complaint calls from leaders through first 6 acquisitions, was about running into a mid-level ops person, let's say an operations person, or maybe a managing salesperson, who has said to someone in the acquired organization, "We bought you, so you just have to do it this way." And you would
Right.
just go, "Oh my, I'm going to be working on this for the next week," because it was cancer.
Yeah.
And where that's what highlighted to me, Tom, the miss on focusing inward on the change management. When I started to hear that, I went, we've missed here because our people are prepared to to have those hard conversations. They revert to the hammer. We bought you, as opposed to
Right.
the feather of, yeah, I know this is really tricky. Let me explain to you why we do it this way, and take the time that's needed. And that's a tough ask out of anyone.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's such an interesting. That's a big thing that I'm hearing from you that initially you missed, but then you went back and you started to be more intentional and deliberate around helping your team almost be ready as well, acquisition ready. And what does that actually look like in the day to day?
Yeah, we're
So,
we're working on one right now that I literally said to our chief strategy officer, said, let's not forget about interstate this time around. And we kind of laughed because we both experienced it. He from the deal origination and kind of what are we going to do with them after we get them perspective, and me from the integration perspective. Um, let's let's learn from those past mistakes. And so I like to think we have. It's not perfect, but I like to think we've learned those lessons.
yeah, this is a great place to wrap up our conversation,
Right.
Tony. If you were to uh, encapsulate like three things that you think are most critically important for leaders to have in place going into an acquisition, what would those three things be?
Yeah, I think the number one thing is it's about people. And so you really have to be you got to have either a strong north star of empathy and understanding and curiosity and willing to make the extra phone call and scratch the surface a little harder. And if you don't, as the leader driving um, the the acquisition and consequently the integration, have someone on your team that can. I've been blessed by having a couple people on my team that are incredibly tuned in to how people feel. And our CEO is very tuned in to how people feel. So if you got it at the CEO level and got it kind of at the head of marketing level, as an example, you're in pretty good shape if you don't possess those skills, but you have to listen to them, right? I fortunately have those skills, so I was able to kind of help our team along on that front. So keep it about the people. Feedback loops to this day. One of them, I still think it's the greatest secret sauce to integration is you have to ask a bunch of different ways and a bunch of different channels to a bunch of different levels to really understand what's going on. And if you do that work, and we experience this, once you start to lean into that work, you will work through challenges much more quickly than if you ignore the feedback channel. It's a pay now, pay later kind of proposition. And then the last one, we didn't talk a whole lot about this. We touched on it, but communication, over communicate. You can't communicate it enough times. And again, people, my experience is when people are shocked or they're afraid, they shut down, they don't hear anymore. And so you got to come back to them. You got to package it differently sometimes, and you've got to use your feedback loops to understand, is my message resonating? You're going to have to do it more than you're comfortable with. It's just not natural to have to say something 10 times, I guess, unless you have small children or teenagers or whatever the case may be. You got to over communicate.
Yeah. Great takeaways. One of the things that really uh, sort of why I was looking forward to our conversation today, but also we connected a few weeks ago and we had some prep time. But you struck me as an individual that was very much a student of leadership, and so you think about this. You're intentional about it. You're very conscious of how you're showing up as a leader. If I were to hit you with, I'm going to hit you with three questions here that I ask a lot of
Okay.
our guests. And the first one is, what's the best piece of advice you've ever received that has been critical and important to kind of who you are today, your success?
Um, it's a great, it's a great question. I think probably it's a body of advice around curiosity. And, for a long time in our company, as we were going through this, for many of the cycles of acquisitions, be curious was a mantra. And 3 years ago, I took over our national sales team for a period of time, a couple years. They were in a little bit of disarray, and it was a transformation effort with a team that produced $250 million of revenue kind of annually. So not to be, you got to kind of treat it right. And I showed up kind of day one with them. I understand that it's not been a great ride up till now, but let's be curious about that and try to pour that into their culture. And it worked with a good number of them. And I think we transformed that team through, in part, being curious instead of thinking you've got the answer or knowing. Be curious.
Yeah. As students of leadership, which we both are, what's your best leadership book that you've ever read? Any one stand out?
Yeah, oddly, and this will sound a little bit interesting, anything Malcolm Gladwell has written, and again, what is it? Behavioral economist. I think that's what he
Yeah.
is. That's
Sociologist, scientist. Yep.
sociologist.
Mhm.
They're not, many times it is about leadership. Many times it's about people and psychology and understanding where tipping points are, to steal the title of one of his books. I think everything he wrote was good. There's a professor at USC, and I can't for the life of me remember his name, the leadership professor, world renowned. He wrote a book called, I think, On Leadership, or something along those lines. And I learned about him in grad school, and I read his book, and it's one of the best leadership books I've ever written because it looks at historical figures, people like Abraham Lincoln, but not from um, a historical leadership perspective, but what was in his DNA that made him such a unique, interesting leader. It took me down a very interesting path, and so those two guys, and then I'm very quietly a Simon Sinek fan, and in large part, he's very commercialized now, and he's very successful, and God bless him. But there are things, one of his original speeches was on why. It was a target and it was why. And it
Yep.
struck me, one is I'm a Bulls fan and he talks about Michael Jordan during that. And
Yeah.
the other is he's not wrong. He was talking about why do I care? And the curiosity thing, back to that. And so there's kind of three examples of things that I
Yeah.
gravitate towards.
That's great. My last question. We oftentimes do a best leader exercise in the work that we do with leaders where they describe that best leader, that leader they looked up to. And so my last question is a little bit related to that. How do you want to be remembered? If you could capture it in 2 to 3 words, how do you want people to answer that
Yeah,
question around what it was like to work with you?
that's so interesting, Todd, 'cause I don't fire that way generally. I don't worry. Legacy is not a thing I worry a whole lot about. I just am trying to get through every day, if you will.
Well, you're way too
Sometimes,
young for that. You
yeah,
don't think
no,
about that
no,
quite
it's
yet.
it's that's not a bad thing. It just is. It's interesting. I would hope that when people engage with me, generally, they leave feeling as though they are leaving with value, either in direction, clarity, advice, listening. One of the biggest skills we have as leaders is the ability to close your crap and just listen. And I think many people find that um, I'm very good at that skill, and then very good at getting a different perspective on challenges. And so problem solving and listening and helping kind of coach people through that process of problem solving is, I think, what they would say.
Beautiful. This has been great, Tony. Thank you so much for your time. How do people get a hold of you?
Oh, well,
LinkedIn, is that a good way to, if they
yeah,
have questions
you
or
can
whatnot?
find me on LinkedIn, and don't be afraid to send me a random email. God forbid that the hackers get a hold of me, but Tony.Garver at firstonsite.com. Send me an email.
Beautiful.
I love hooking up with people, Tom. I've enjoyed the heck out of this. First one I've done. I hope I did okay, but thank you. It was just a ton of fun to chat with you.
Awesome. It was a pleasure. All right. Best of you on your next acquisition, Tony.
No, thanks, Tom.
All right. That is a wrap for this episode. I jotted down a whole variety of things, but some of my big takeaways from my conversation with Tony included leadership is crucially important, particularly with M&A activity. It's not just about doing the deal. It's about integration. It's about getting connected to people. And he talked about it starts with those initial communications, being clear on where the organization, the new organization, the combined organization is going and how people fit into that bigger picture. He talked about over communicating to help mitigate some of those fears and uncertainties. He talked about feedback loops as being essentially really an important aspect. He drove that home. He talked about curiosity, understanding where the senior leadership team from the acquired organization, how do they approach things? How do they look at different scenarios and being curious around that? He talked about engaging with employees and being visible on site, and that does foster trust and collaboration. He talked about recognizing the emotional impact of these acquisitions on people, and he had a constant people-centric theme throughout. And then the last thing he talked about was balancing that autonomy with the acquired organization with being clear on what some of those non-negotiables are that are part of an effective integration. And it's a constant balance. Although this context was really focused on M&A, these practices can be applied to a variety of leadership situations in organizations around reorgs and culture shifts and whatnot. And so good things to keep in mind. For a summary of my key takeaways, check out the show notes. If you've enjoyed today's podcast, we ask that you follow us on your favorite podcast platform. And if you're up for it, leave us a rating because your support does help others find this particular show. Until next time, my challenge to you is, as it always is to be more conscious, be more aware of how you're showing up with yourself, your team, and your organization. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.